It would seem that every human interaction is a bit tainted as a result of the fall. I think we could probably say that the most, how to simplify it in many ways is they're defined oftentimes by power struggles, aren't they? It's who's going to have control. Our interpersonal relationships, this goes from friends and family and coworkers. Today we're going to talk about it within the context of marriage primarily, but we will finish in a way that is going to apply to even folks who aren't married. There are some principles here that are just general principles for life. But when it comes to power struggles within marriage, those narratives, those stories, those kind of incidences make really good sitcom episodes, don't they? I mean, it's fun and funny, and we laugh at those things. But in real life, it's not always that funny, is it? If there's this ongoing sense of struggle for power, it can be not a funny marriage, but actually a very difficult and challenging marriage. Though within the world system, it is probably the most common way that we find marriages functioning today amongst unbelievers. At least that would be their default. They don't have within them the resource to honestly live any other way. But those who are exiles, those who are just traveling through this land, we're not home yet. Peter talks about us as being exiles, strangers in a strange land. There ought to be something a little bit strange about us as it relates to power in marriage. Today we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about it in two different areas, both the wives and the husbands. The wives seeing the power of a winning wife, and then the husband, we're going to see the power of a good husband. So the power of a winning wife begins in verses 1 and 2. We'll go through verse 6 and then verse 7 for husbands. But let me just read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3 of 1 Peter. And if you don't have a Bible, I'd encourage you to look it up on your phone. It's helpful to look at these things as we're wrestling with it together. I use various different translations. I'm using the ESV today, if you want to know where I'm at today. But beginning in verse 1, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Now, I know that word submit, it can cause us to be a little bit bristled, and I want you to kind of bear with us as we work our way through this, because I think you'll see what's happening here. I sent out, a text this morning with the question, is God a misogynist? Because it could easily, if not understood properly what's happening within the biblical text, one could easily assume that he is. Especially if we go down to verse 7 where it talks about wives being the weaker vessel. What does that mean? Well, we're going to get to that. And so a big part of doing Bible and theology well is to realize that we come to this word with our theological bags packed. And we have a tendency to have a screen through which we kind of filter the text. And that comes from perhaps your upbringing, perhaps some past, experiences in different churches, different teachings that may not line up. And so the goal, the work of the Spirit, is to remove those barriers in order that we can just really truly see what is said before us within the context of Scripture and history as this was written to a group of people. And as we've said before, we're talking about new believers. He says that you're in exile, not to consider yourself as part of this. You're a resident alien. You have an official role here, but you are not from this land. And so we're to be a little bit different. And the first part, as it relates to a wife's role in her husband, is to submit, verses 1 and 2, as an act of worship. And let's not forget that part, as an act of worship. Now, culturally, this would have been very scandalous, not the idea of submitting, but the amount of time Peter is going to spend talking to wives. So they would have been in the same category as slaves in that culture. They wouldn't be considered those who have a full personhood. And so likewise, when Peter's addressing household servants, and I would make the argument that they were more like slaves than we would like to admit, that even there, it's a scandalous move. That he's speaking to a group of people that culture would say they don't have full personhood. They would be considered more like property than people. And so just by addressing in such a lengthy detail, Peter is elevating these demographics within the culture that at that time looks at them as property. But with this, we want to understand a couple things for clarity's sake. He's not telling wives to submit to all men, nor is he telling them to submit to abuse. That's really important. I've dealt with, pastoral situations where wives have kind of read these verses and actually were submitting to kind of an abusive situation, and that's not what he's talking about here at all. And so if you know somebody that is in an abusive situation, you can encourage them to say, no, you don't have to submit to this abuse. But he's speaking to wives who are married to unbelieving husbands. And he's wanting them to bring a basic principle into play that would have been familiar to the Jewish folks and understanding of as it relates to God's design for marriage. So there are some administrative roles that God has as it relates to marriage, but they aren't one isn't lesser than the other. So oftentimes when I'm leading a wedding, I'll say something like this, because it's often the cliche that, when God, when he thought of marriage, he had you two in mind. Well, no, he didn't. He did not have you two in mind. According to Ephesians, when he came up with marriage, he had Christ and his bride, the church, in mind. So the union of husband and wife is dignified in each role and meant they are to put on display the love affair that Christ has with his bride, the church. And so they're equals in this putting on display the gospel. And they both have a role to play within that, roles which they are both accountable to, men and women. But at the center of this, as it is with every relationship, is to be what we would say the fear of the Lord. Am I kind of breaking up there? Just for a second, I'm good. Okay. The fear of the Lord in verse 17, I want to just go back a second, of chapter 2. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. And that we talked about back there, that was kind of a little bit of a slight to Nero, who was to be worshipped. He's saying, no, just honor him, respect him like you do everybody. But at the center of all your relationships are your relationships with the brotherhood, with believers. And what drives this is the fear of the Lord. So often a mistake as it relates to the fear of the Lord is just to put it in the category of that, God's going to get you or you're going to receive some punishment or discipline. That is the case in times when we talk about the fear of the Lord. But fundamentally, it's a fear that relates to something that we experience every day in our culture as we watch people who have their own idols. People are kind of, a young kid he's a musician or he's an athlete or an actor or something like that. They're idol. And if they were to enter into that idol's presence, they wouldn't want to do anything that would embarrass themselves, because they want to be like their idol. And so it's this sense of fear and trembling, this great joy and excitement over who this person is. That's the fear of the Lord. It's this great joy and excitement over who this person is, this God, and I don't want to do anything that would embarrass him, or that I would embarrass myself in front of him. Because I treasure him. There's a joy about who he is, and I'm wanting to be like him, not running from him. I'm running to him, and I'm wanting to be like him. And as we've seen in the life of Jesus, he is one who over and over again shows the moral superiority of humility and sacrifice over self-preservation even. And so the goal in this relationship is to win this unbelieving husband over. And it's not done through nagging. It doesn't mean you don't ever share the gospel, but this I think has various implications for everybody. Children or friends or co-workers, we don't berate them into believing. We win them over in our character, in our relationships, and how we treat them. We give the gospel some substance as it relates to how we live. So the power of a winning wife is seen in her submission, and it's seen in cultivating the right kind of beauty, verses 3 through 4. Do not let your adornment be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adornment be the hidden person of the heart, of the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Some of your translations may have the word in italics there, merely. Do not let your adornment be merely. I think that's helpful, because, Peter really isn't any more against you braiding your hair or wearing jewelry than he is you wearing clothing, which we think, that's a good idea, right? Boy, that'd be an odd church if we said no. Yeah. Although the attendance might rise a little bit, right? Yeah, so. Okay, now I'm getting way off. I better watch it. So it's not to be this merely this outward thing. And so I tell you what, this is part of womanhood, is to want to beautify herself, to become attractive. And that's a good thing. That's part of what it means in many ways to be a woman, but it's not meant to be just external. There was a song during the 80s or 90s, "She Ain't Pretty, She Just Looks That Way." And we all know that this is, a secular group. There's an observation. Yeah, she looks pretty, but she's really not pretty. Because there's more to beauty than external. And she's not one who's using her physical beauty as a means of manipulating her husband either in this type of situation. As a matter of fact, she's not governed so much by external things, but by this inward beauty that is to be cultivated, because everything else is passing away. Verses 22 through 25 of chapter 1. It might just be on the next page if you have a setup like mine. Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a heart. Okay, there it is. Since you have been born again, not of perishable seeds, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding Word of God. For all flesh, all humanity is like grass, and its glory, the glory of humanity, is like the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls off. But the word of the Lord remains forever. So there are things that have lasting beauty, have an eternal value, and then there are things that just have a temporal value. And he's telling wives to beautify, cultivate the things that are most important, that have an eternal, ongoing sense of beauty, this inward beauty. And by the way, if we were comparing this to the book of Ephesians, this would be the job of a husband, to help his wife become beautiful in the Lord. To help her cultivate an inner beauty. So, winning wife submits, cultivates the right kind of beauty, and then she follows the example of the past women, verses 5 through 6. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do what is good and do not fear anything that is frightening. And so from here on out, Suzanne's going to have to call me Lord. Lord Jeff. What'd you say? Finally, yeah. Finally. Well, that's not what's happening here. There's a culture. She was doing something that was culturally appropriate as it relates to showing her husband honor and respecting him. But he's giving us an example of another sojourner, somebody who's just passing through. They were basically nomads in many ways for a good part of their life, Abraham and Sarah. But notice this, that he lifts Sarah up as a pillar of faith to follow. And in many ways, she's a better example as one who is a pillar of faith in certain situations than Abraham himself, who oftentimes functioned not as a believer but an unbeliever. Abraham wasn't an outstanding husband. On 2 occasions, Abraham said to his wife, I'm kind of a little worried about how this is going to turn out for me. So these group of men, just go with them, tell them you're my sister, and do whatever they tell you to do. Twice he did that to her. Twice. So Abraham, in many ways, at different times, acted like an unbeliever, and Peter's using this as an example to encourage wives who are married to unbelievers. And to show your faith, your trust in God, by honoring your husband and doing what would be culturally appropriate, calling him Lord. She still called him Lord. That's an amazing act of faith. Was her trust in her husband? No. Because she functioned without what he says here, not fearing anything that is frightening. What does that mean? Well, he's speaking to a group of women who would have been very, very encouraged by this. They're living with unbelieving husbands who would see them as property. And in the Roman culture, if you didn't like your wife, you could just accuse her of adultery and she would be executed. That's a frightening situation to be in. Well, he's comparing it to the frightening situations that Sarah was put in. How frightening would it have been for her to be put in a situation, go just do whatever these guys tell you. And so he's holding her up as an example to these women going, okay, in this day and age, we have different choices. If your husband's telling you to go off with some other guys, you're okay, buddy, done. Or if you're in a situation where you're subject to abuse, you walk. But the examples that we're looking at in 1 Peter, at least this time in history, they had no other choice. They were stuck. You were viewed as property, and Sarah, nomad, she had nowhere to go. And so the power of a winning wife is one that is submitting to this husband that may not deserve it. In a way, she's putting Christ on display through her humility and sacrifice. And the goal is to win him over to the things of God, which applies both to, unbelieving husbands and sometimes believing husbands that need to be won over to the things of God. And so the power, struggles continue continue within this and we talk about the power of a good husband. It's not, we're not talking about power struggles trying to get the upper hand. It is the power of a winning wife and a power of a good husband. Verse 7. I'm just going to read the whole thing and then we're going to look at it in parts. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the women as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So we want to be looking at this and we're thinking through, okay, he's giving 6 verses to wives and only 1 to husbands. Why the disparity? Well, first of all, it kind of goes back to what we had talked about. He's dignifying wives by really giving a detailed instruction to them. In their culture, it would be very normative if, like, a Christian man would be a Christian, then his whole family would have to adopt that religion. The reverse wouldn't be the case. If a woman became a Christian, it wouldn't be automatically expected that the family would adopt her religion, so to speak. But the core concern as it relates to all these verses towards women is ultimately relating to their vulnerability in being married to an unbelieving husband. He is recognizing you are a vulnerable demographic. And he's leading them on in the Lord and in faith. When the Bible, we look at things like that and we go, well, how come there isn't, this instruction towards, some type of social reform? You don't see that in the New Testament. New Testament's all about having your relationship with God and your relationship with others. Does that mean we don't work towards social reform? Absolutely not. If we have an opportunity to deal with injustice as it relates to how people are treated throughout history, a lot of times it's been Christians who have led the way in that, and that's a good thing. But with that, we also need to understand how limited we are in that, because we are sojourners. We are exiles. Foreigners don't have much of an opportunity to change the social structures of the land in which they find themselves. They're not native to that land. And so the ability to have an influence that has lasting change is going to be very limited. But we're thankful for the history of some of the things that have brought about more equal rights as it relates to women. And I think there's things that are built within our culture that are still problematic. It wasn't until 1974, think about this, 1974, that if a woman wanted to get a loan, the only way she could do that is if her husband would sign with her. That's not too long ago. So there's built within the human condition this misogynistic view towards women. That's from the fall, folks. That's from the fall. This dismissive view towards women. But the good news is that, lasting reform, lasting change will happen when Jesus returns and puts everything back to its right under God's rule and blessing, and those who misuse their power will be held accountable. But heirs and co-heirs with Christ, women, men, everybody equal. But let's look at the role of men in this in the first part. Be considerate of your wife. Verse 8, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. I want to point out something here, that word likewise. Don't overlook that. That's a term relating to submission. In chapter 2, verse 18 through 3:7, we have people submitting to others. Servants, be subject to your husbands. Likewise, servants be subject to your masters. Likewise, wives, be subject to your husbands. Likewise, husbands. There's a tone of submission here that runs all the way through. His submission just looks a little bit different in that he is to subject themselves to their wives in an understanding way. Taking the time to listen to her, to get to know her, to make yourself available to her. Ephesians puts it this way: the role of the husband is to not get what he wants out of his life and not get what he wants out of his wife, but to sacrifice himself for her. So we don't see this idea that the wife exists to meet the husband's expectation of what a good wife is. Which is oftentimes how this is presented. And I have seen more than my fair share of abuse within evangelical households where men oftentimes function more as a domineering patriarch over and against that of a lover. The Christian marriage is one that's supposed to be a love affair that reflects Christ's love affair with his bride, the church. The role of the husband is that of Christ sacrificing his life for her. The role of the wife is to submit in this loving union. Not this domineering patriarchal type view that we oftentimes see. And men love that because it's built within your sinful nature, guys. It is built within from the time of the fall to have a misogynistic, a dismissive view towards women. And so any misreading of Scripture as it relates to the husband and wife, scenario is oftentimes celebrated by a guy who really doesn't get grace or what this thing's supposed to look like. So they are to submit in being considerate of their wives, and they're to submit in honoring their wives. Verse 7b, she'll honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Oh, well, there she is. She's just a weaker vessel. She's less than guys, fundamentally, right? That's where it's at. She doesn't have as much value as guys. There's not as much to women as there are guys. Is that what's happening here? Let me ask you this. Here, Bible study question. Considering the context, the verses that we just read before this, verses 3 through 6, what makes the woman weaker? Anybody?
She's vulnerable.
What's that?
She's vulnerable.
She's vulnerable. In a submissive role, she is vulnerable. So, likewise, show honor to your wife as the more vulnerable vessel. She has a submissive role, so she's naturally that much more vulnerable. It doesn't mean she's less in any way, and it gets so frustrating to me how difficult it is for good Christians to be able to read their Bibles. Instead of reading so much into it, just read it. It's right there, isn't it? But they're equals. Honoring her as an equal of the grace of life. And by the way, within the Trinity, there is a functional subordination. Father, Son, and Spirit are all equally God. No less than each other. But the Son submits in a subordinate role to the Father, and the Spirit submits in a subordinate role to Jesus. So the submission of the subordinate role is not because there is anything substantially less than in this situation. It's just a role that is being played out. But looking back, we don't have to look at all of these. but as it relates to the grace of life. But you can kind of remember chapter 1 where he talks about us being inheriting an imperishable inheritance that's kept for us in heaven. Later on, we talked about we being a holy people of God, chosen for His purposes. And then even just shortly before this, we're going astray and now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of our souls. We have the same shepherd and overseer. The grace of life is equally yours, heirs and co-heirs in Christ. And to mistreat women, mistreat your wives, there are serious. This is serious business to the Lord. There are consequences. Did you notice the consequences back in verse 7 of chapter 3? So that your prayers may not be hindered. If you have a dismissive view towards your wife, a misogynistic view towards your wife, you're blocking your prayers. You're cutting yourself off from the Father in a certain way. That's how serious God takes this. And so when it comes to power struggles within the marriage, what we're supposed to see is the power of a winning wife and the power of a good husband, the power of a wife who is displaying the humility and sacrifice of Christ, trying to win her husband over. And you see the power of an understanding husband that is showing his wife honor. And we can simplify this in the idea that Christians are to treat their spouse in a way that express and bring about the healing power of God's redeeming love. All other relationships without the healing power of God's redeeming love are moving in this downward spiral, or at least maintaining some type of functional power plays. I kind of have the power in this area and you have the power in that area, and this works for us. And you don't see the redemption, the work of the gospel within either one of those. And yet God has equipped us as believers to function in a way that we can now become vehicles through which God's redeeming power, the power of His love, enters into the marriage. In cherishing, in honoring, and winning each other over. And so we're to be peculiar people in this world, in our marriages, that's supposed to be showing the love affair between Christ and His bride, the church. And we have been set up for this, and this is in many ways what Peter is talking about. Back in chapter 1, verse 9, he talks about that we are present tense, receiving the outcome of our faith, the salvation of our souls. The salvation of your soul is a present tense reality. It's the salvation of your whole person. Who you are in relationship to God, yourself, and to other people in the culture and the world around you. You're being delivered, simply put, the same is true in James as we've been going through James, is you're being delivered from the ruin of sin. Of a life turned in on itself. Being saved from that kind of life in order that you might be a vehicle, a vessel, where God's redeeming love may flow from that. And so our example is that of the overseer of our soul, chapter 2, verse 25, which he has we see within him the moral superiority of humility and sacrifice. And so it's not this idea within marriage like, well, I'm keeping up my end of the deal. I'm playing my part. You better be playing your part. Doesn't matter. Each of us are accountable before the Lord, whether our spouse really jumps in with what this is supposed to look like or not. But let's talk about, just for a couple of seconds here, the principles that apply to those who are not married. The basic principles is that every relationship should be marked by opportunities to bring God's healing power of redemption into it. Not by power plays. Who we're becoming on the inside rather than the outside, not manipulating and following Sarah's example in every relationship. But let's land with this, because I think this is what gives this the strength, the enablement, and the how we do this. It's called the grace of life. Which is Jesus himself. When God talks about us giving his grace, it's not like he kind of pulls some out of his back pocket and says, here's $20. What ties us into the things of God, what secures us with the things of God, is God himself. Being spiritually united to us. That's what it means to be born again. That's what it means to have, and why you have this inheritance. Because you have the inheritance of Christ. Because I'm united to him. And so the grace of life is Jesus himself who enables us towards the proper view of power in marriage. Let's pray. Father, thanks for my friends who are here today. It's really nice to be able to just get a little preachy and talk about your word together. This is an important text. There's some principles in here that go far beyond just married couples as it relates to who we're becoming and living out the grace of life that we are partakers of because Jesus has united himself to us. If we get anything, let us get that, Lord, in order that we might that much more become vehicles of your healing power, the healing power of your redeeming love. In Christ's name.